Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, a podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 228, Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest. Last time, we talked about Antietam, and specifically Burnside's Bridge, and that sector of the battle. I think we gave a little more focus on that particular area, which maybe I very quickly glossed over in our main narrative, or at the very least, I didn't spend as much time on it as, say, the cornfield or the sunken road. This week, we will have another analysis, much as we've been doing in some of our recent episodes. We will be doing two generals that I think get their own set of fanfare, one probably more positively than the other. I think in this we can compare and contrast just a little bit between the two. So for this week, we're going to talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest and Jeb Stuart. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And of course, as this episode is dropping, we should have a movie review. And we did Emancipation, a recent movie as the time of this recording anyway, starring Will Smith. And in that movie, it actually portrays Port Hudson, something that does not get a whole lot of portrayal, I think, in other movies. So we talk about that. We've done other movie reviews, memoir reviews, picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So we will have now our first combined analysis for two huge figures of the war that continue to have a large following. Even if you are more casual in your Civil War knowledge, you definitely have heard of Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest. They continue to be polarizing figures. We have the KKK affiliation for Forrest and the name of the title character in Forrest Gump. In Virginia, we recently had a statue of Jeb Stuart come down, and in another part of the state, a high school bearing its name has been changed. While these are definitely touchy subjects, what I think cannot be argued is that these are two of the more influential figures when it comes to cavalry during the war. I think that there are some similarities between them, including but not limited to the fact that both command infantry at one point and do a pretty good job. In the case of Forrest, his cavalry is used more as mounted infantry in several battles. They both kind of disappoint toward the end of their careers, letting their respective commanders down in key showdowns in their particular theaters. They both also carry this crazy name recognition that sometimes will lead to good results on the battlefield, as even in contemporary times, everyone had heard of the prowess of Stuart and the aggression of Forrest. This is surprising considering they are very different individuals. More so than other officers, I think much is made of their personalities. For me, this is a good look, as we often kind of treat these figures as names on a piece of paper and not the actual humans they were. Forrest is famously documented as having this prickly and fiery personality. He is not afraid to strike individuals. In certain instances, there are famous stories of him where he is able to not only berate, but somehow also use his fist in a case where you're like, wow, this guy is really something in terms of a personality, is something in terms of a figure, right? And know whether those stories are actually really verbatim true or whether it's kind of just part of his legend, it's open to debate. In contrast, Jeb Stuart is jovial. He's more of a knight than he is kind of this hard-nosed individual who's getting in there, getting in the trenches. He's more of the nobility that we come to associate or have come to associate certain Confederate officers, and certainly in a contemporary sense, that he would have been more of the beau ideal of that kind of world. We can kind of understand the why for both in their respective upbringing. Stuart was old army, while Forrest was not, but both are able to use the tools of their past experiences to great advantage. A big difference is that Forrest is going to be mostly operating outside the realm of our two main theaters of the war, while Jeb Stuart is going to be in the thick of the main theater, a mainstay for some time. It is not lost on me that perhaps there could be additions to this analysis. We might be able to add in Joe Wheeler or John Hunt Morgan, but really, for the first one, let's just stick with these two. Could they have had similar careers if they had switched places? I do not think so, personally, but we can get to that in more of the rundown as we talk about their service. James Ewell Brown Stuart was born in Patrick County, Virginia, which is the southern part of Virginia close to the North Carolina border. He did come from Scotch-Irish stock, his grandfather having commanded a regiment in the American Revolution. Actually, he had served at Guilford Courthouse, which was one of the more important latter-stage battles of the war that eventually leads for the bottling up of Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown. Early, Stuart would attend Emory and Henry College before obtaining an appointment to West Point in 1850. He would be referred to at the academy as Beauty, which was a play on him being not as an attractive in his teen years. He would eventually grow a beard in his later life, one of the trademarks of his appearance. Robert E. Lee would be superintendent during part of his time in school, and Fitzhugh Lee would attend around the same time. Thus, Stuart would have a connection with the Lee family. Post-military academy, he would be sent to serve in the U.S. Cavalry in Kansas, where he would be under Edwin Sumner, future federal general. In 1855, he would marry Flora Cook, daughter of Philip St. George Cook, at the time commanding the 2nd U.S. Dragoons. While serving in the West, Stuart would show his quality in the mounted arm, as he was present for not only bleeding Kansas, but also wounded in a skirmish with Cheyenne. He would develop a saber hook, which he would receive a patent for. So, in 1859, he would find himself in Washington to discuss not only the hook, but also his appointment to the quartermaster department. This would be during John Brown's famous raid, explaining why he was present to accompany Lee and the company of U.S. Marines to Harper's Ferry, as Stuart had knowledge of Brown during his time in Kansas. In the meantime, Stuart's family was growing, Flora having already given birth to a daughter, but then also a son, who would go through a name change, Stuart resigning his commission, joining the Confederacy, his son originally named for his father-in-law, who would remain with the Union. We didn't really talk a whole lot about Philip St. George Cook. I think really his biggest contribution is going to be charging at Gaines's Mill, where the Confederates famously will, or at least part of them, would form square, and that cavalry charge is not going to have any kind of meaningful results for the Union. For Forrest, his tough upbringing would match his tough demeanor. He was born in 1821 in Tennessee. His family had migrated from Virginia and North Carolina, Nathan and a twin sister being the oldest of 12 children. His father was a blacksmith who passed away in 1837. This made young Nathan the primary caregiver of the family at only 16 years of age. Obviously, this would make him a little rougher, probably the hardest upbringing so far we have gone through in these analysis episodes. As still a young man, he would go into business with his uncle, who was murdered by two business partners, sparking Nathan to seek revenge upon them, where he killed one with a pistol and the other with a knife. His forays into business would include stagecoaches as well as a brickyard, several different types of establishments. This would also include slave trading and hunting down escaped enslaved. All of his brothers would follow him into this business, and it would be in this capacity where he would unknowingly be trained in his future endeavors as a Confederate cavalryman. He would need to have a keen sense of strategy and knowing the lay of the land. Additionally, you would probably reasonably suspect him to be pretty well versed in these kind of small unit tactics, hit and run tactics, kind of the ability to strike with precision and then be able to then extradite his command as well as his grouping should he need to. So there's a lot of different ways in which he's going to take that knowledge and he's going to use it on a grander scale during the Civil War. Eventually, this business would be large enough to operate not only in Memphis, but Vicksburg as well, albeit with facilities that, if you look at them and look at their description, sound very similar to future prisoner of war camps. Unfortunately, this would also include some illegal trafficking. While we can find these actions in the modern sense immoral, I think we can also look at Forrest in the context of the average non-slave holding Southern man. Nathan had risen from poverty to become quite wealthy, being elected alderman in Memphis before the war. He is able to use the institution to his advantage, to become very wealthy, something that if you were already in the system, you would aspire to. So I mentioned that not necessarily to excuse this kind of behavior, but I do think that it is important, as I've mentioned in past episodes, to understand the overall context of why the average Southerner, at least, is going to serve for the Confederacy, those that do, right? Even if they are not, in fact, slaveholders, even if perhaps they are on the outside looking in from this rich planting elite, this wealthy kind of top, 1%, shall we say, there, sort of. But this is why, right? They want to be able to profit off of this kind of existence, and this is what they had in their reality there in the South, whether it's these large cash crops that are requiring this kind of manpower to go ahead and be successful. So this is something that they're going to definitely look at, and Forrest is just kind of a case in point example of having this hope, and then if it's being taken away, then that's obviously all of your hope going out the door. Now we have to try to figure out something else. Well, there you go. That's one of the reasons that I mentioned before as to why a lot of these individuals are going to join the Army. He would sell his interest in the trading company shortly before the war, reinvesting into property, notably plantations. Forrest would marry Mary Ann Montgomery in 1845, and he would have 2 children, William and Fanny. In the early outbreak of the war, Stuart would report to Johnson's Shenandoah Army in 1861. While originally designated for infantry, Jackson would assign him to cavalry there. This was a wise choice, as Stuart would become colonel of the 1st Virginia very quickly. As mentioned, his experience leading immediately up to the war had been primarily cavalry, so it would be a good fit. He would build up the Black Horse cavalry, even though many of his troopers in fact did not have black horses. He would actually put his stamp on early in the war, as actually in Falling Waters, he captures a large amount of Federals. And then at First Bull Run, he would see his first larger scale action. Originally, PGT Beauregard would be determined that cavalry was really only good to guard his flanks. But in an all-hands-on-deck situation, Stuart would find part of his mounted regiment on the field and launch a famous charge at the 11th New York Fire Zouaves. As we discussed in our redo episode from First Manassas, it is questionable as to whether this charge accomplished really anything, as concentrated fire had already dislodged the New Yorkers, and then the cavalry charge sort of fizzled out anyway. He was dissuaded from falling on the rear of McDowell's retreating forces by regulars, and overall the Confederates would not follow up on their victory. Jeb Stuart, though, would see his laurels on the field rewarded with the rank of Brigadier General as a result. In 1861, Forrest would initially enlist as a private, which was surprising for several reasons. Even Wade Hampton, who was also one of the more wealthier men in the South, came in as an officer. But they also did not really have to enlist at all. Despite initially being a private in the 7th Tennessee, Forrest would soon become officer. We can see that he had a knack for leadership and would personally be involved with his men. Could also say that Forrest also has a lack of respecting authority as well, so there's a little bit of that's tied into this decision where he's just going to go ahead and do his own thing. Lack of control, maybe, you could also kind of throw that out there, and that kind of makes sense, having already talked about his upbringing and how he just kind of pulls himself up by his bootstraps, essentially, and becomes this businessman. So yeah, you could probably imagine that coming in as a private would not be something that necessarily Forrest would be able to sustain. His first action would come at Sacramento, Kentucky, in late 1861, where he would personally lead a charge against Federal cavalry. This would be a good preview for better or for worse with Forrest, but would be inspiring for men to join up with him. We can also say that despite being illiterate, Forrest did build up successful business ventures prior to the war, So maybe we could spin this experience into more of a salesman who could bring recruits into the ranks, especially in Tennessee, which, as we have highlighted before, was fairly split. Several times during the war, he would need to get the numbers up for his cavalry, and each time he was able to do so, at least putting together a sizable force for what was on hand. 1862 would be a busy year for Stuart, not only for the man himself, but also for his legend, and probably the ego that gets attached to it. While commanding cavalry, there was not a whole lot to do as McClellan's army approached Richmond. Post Seven Pines, though, I believe that Stuart, along with the defense at Drury's Bluff, at Fort Darling, is going to help to turn the tide and shift momentum back to the Confederates. Of course, for Stuart, this would include one of his famous rides around the Union Army. For that is exactly what Stuart is going to do. He is going to actually have his cavalry circle the Union forces. Successfully, he would make it back to rebel lines, and really, it was more for propaganda purposes than anything being a huge win in terms of a raid. There was a little bit of destruction of supplies, and there was going to be some harassment of the Federal cavalry, which is going to kind of lead into Stuart's legend. But really the most important part of this raid is that Stuart is going to unlock the fact that the northern part of the Union Army was going to be in the air and not supported. Part of this was McClellan's assumption that eventually reinforcements from McDowell would be on the way, but it was going to be a golden opportunity in the meantime for new Confederate Army leader Robert E. Lee to attack, which he would do, sparking the 7 days that is going to eventually send the Federals back to Harrison's Landing. Stuart would continue to operate with the army and actually almost see disaster prior to a successful raid at Catlet Station. Remember that Stuart had almost been captured due to a failure for proper pickets being posted by the infantry. Catlet Station, though, would raid into the supply for John Pope's army and would dissuade any continued pushes south. It's going to be adding into Stuart his raid upon Pope's supply. Jackson is also striking at Cedar Mountain, and then he's going to launch his famous flank movement, and that's going to see Pope actually kind of reeling and backpedaling a lot. It completely takes the campaign that maybe he had planned off the rails. This is going to lead to the flank movement of Jackson getting into the rear of the Federals. Cavalry would screen Longstreet, as he too would slip from the enemy, flanking through Thoroughfare Gap, hitting the enemy in the large flank attack at Second Manassas. Stuart's troopers would be assigned to the flank of this move and engage Federal counterparts at Lewis Ford across the run. Buford would temporarily see some success against Munford's cavalry, but Stuart would apply reinforcement and overwhelm the Federal troopers, capturing many of them and sending them from the field. With this success, we have the growing legend of Stuart, a teetotaler who loved the company of women and music. Members of his staff were eccentrics or could play instruments. He would be away from the army, holding a ball in Maryland prior to the battles of South Mountain and Antietam. This kind of gives us an idea of where his priorities were, right? It's kind of building into the legend, right? He needs to kind of play the part almost in that, yes, we are kind of these knights that have our musicians with us, they're our traveling minstrels, if you will, and we hold these balls and do things for the honor of women. And even though I have seen that Stuart is not necessarily unfaithful to his wife, it is just part of that ethos, right? That we're doing this for the honor of these individuals, right? Of the Southern women, and that's kind of how he plays up into this legend. Stuart was present at Antietam and might have actually been in charge of launching a flank attack in Jackson's sector of the field. However, this is really never going to come to fruition. Lee's going to have this idea that we need to turn the tide during the battle, and Stuart is actually going to be part of reconnoitering that area, and Jackson and Stuart are both going to essentially tell Lee it's not going to work because there's Federal artillery posted in a position that's going to make it not so great for the Confederate attacks, and they're already outnumbered as it was, so it's just not going to get off the ground. Moving back towards Virginia, Stuart would again ride around McClellan, raiding into Pennsylvania, Chambersburg being his target. This would spark Lincoln to write to Little Mac one of his saucier notes, as George B. had said his cavalry needed to rest their horses. Lincoln would respond, that there did not seem to be anything wrong with Stuart's horses. So Stuart's cavalry would continue to screen the Confederates during the less-known Loudoun Valley campaign, McClellan following the retreating rebels until his removal. As the army moved to Fredericksburg, Stuart's star was shining bright. He had met the enemy in a more fixed engagement at Second Manassas, and had continued with his successful raids in the year of 1862. For Forrest, 1862 would see his personality really come to the forefront in the early part of the year. We know that Albert Sidney Johnston is going to have a tough task being charged with a large territory, and the actions of Forts Henry and Donelson were both botched. Forrest is going to be present at the Battle of Fort Donelson, and he's actually going to perform fairly well. Really, Forrest, for the most part, along with some select other Confederate generals, he's really going to probably be the brightest star for the Confederates. He's going to be everywhere at once, displaying his kind of prowess on the battlefield. He's going to have his troops in the action, whereas, again, cavalry, at least in this early stage of the war, is going to be more used for scouting, screening purposes, whatnot, than anything. But his guys are going to be more combat troops who are going to really get into the action. So Forrest is going to actually have good marks for Fort Donelson. He's actually going to capture a battery during the Confederate assault. But once it was decided that the Confederate forces were going to surrender, Forrest is going to have his personality come to the stage. And he's going to say that he is not present at Fort Donelson to surrender, but rather he's going to find a way to escape, which he successfully does, taking not only his cavalry, but also a select number of Confederate infantry with him. Weirdly, after Fort Donelson, many Confederates are essentially just going to walk away, this still being an early action during the conflict. That's not going to show an organized prisoner exchange, or the intake of prisoners is not going to be organized as well as latter stage battles. Forrest's fiery determination will be on full display as he broke away to make it back to friendly lines. At Shiloh, Forrest is going to be involved yet again. Following the first day's assault, he would inform Hardee that Union reinforcements in the form of Buell's army were starting to arrive. This warning would not be heeded, Forrest becoming wary of certain officers and the bureaucracy of the army. PGT Beauregard had actually called off the attack on the first day, kind of under the assumption that he would be able to renew the attack on the second day, and that Grant was not going to see any significant kind of reinforcement. But Buell is going to bring an entire army to the field that's going to turn the tide and see the Union take the initiative. They're going to launch their assaults on the second day of Shiloh, and there's not going to be really a whole lot that the Confederates are going to be able to do to stop it. Now, you could also argue that essentially, once the attack ends on the first day, there's really not going to be a whole lot operationally that the Confederates are going to be able to do at Shiloh at all. There is that argument to be made, but you probably, if you had received that kind of intelligence of your PGT Beauregard, there might not have even been a second day at Shiloh. So that's also part of it, right? It's not only that he's going to be able to adjust his plan of attack, maybe he scrubs that plan of attack, gets his army out of there, and we're going to avoid any additional kind of casualties on the second day. In a rearguard action, Forrest would reportedly grab a Union soldier and use him as a human shield when escaping the Federals, in the process being wounded with a close-range shot to the back. Now, it is often considered to be just part of the Forrest legend. Could it have been true that Forrest used a human as a shield and received some kind of wounding? Sure. I think the legend evolves slightly differently in Forrest, though. It's often brought up exactly how many men Forrest personally kills during the war. You don't have that same kind of interest in a body count for Stuart, the consummate cavalier. Fallen Timbers is going to be a great example of this kind of aura that Forrest begins to build. There's often times when you're reading about Forrest, and I experienced this because I've read a couple of different books on Forrest that kind of point this out, where he's often wounded, and it's a wound that a lesser man would have been sidelined for. And part of that could be that Forrest is tough, right? I don't think necessarily you can deny that looking at his service record, but then also it's also sort of how severe was this wounding, right? He's reportedly at Fallen Timbers shot in the spine, which is something that not really a whole lot of guys are going to be able to recover from. And yet he's able to not only get over the wounding, but he's able to actually recover very quickly and be back on campaign. So again, How severe was it? Did he actually get shot? Is he actually grabbing a human being with one hand and hoisting him onto his back? Could something like that have happened? Again, sure. But it's also, again, you have to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt and kind of really think about exactly how did this go down? Is it maybe exaggerated just slightly? During the summer of 1862, he's going to launch one of his raids, in which there's going to involve a strike at Murfreesboro. Again, there are some pieces of legend that we can point to at this affair. Forrest is reported to have shot a sheriff of the town for letting the jail burn with pro-Confederates inside. There are conflicting reports surrounding this. As also said, during this fighting, a camp follower for the Federal cavalry took a shot at Forrest, maybe the first time an African-American fired a shot during the war. What is clear, though, is that Forrest would show his capability in launching a raid and could definitely affect supply lines for the Federals in the region. This is going to be part of the disruption of the operations initially for Vicksburg, right? Because remember, we have the capture of Corinth, and Henry Halleck is going to then go to Washington. Buell's going to have his army moving in the direction of Chattanooga, and then Grant is going to continue to try to get at Vicksburg. It's going to start this very long attempt to try to capture that city. So you have then the disruption in terms of Forrest launching his raid into the Tennessee area. You have the Holly Springs portion of Earl Van Dorn disrupting any kind of supply lines. So it's going to be hard for the Union forces to then go overland toward Vicksburg. You're going to also see in terms of Murfreesboro the beginning of the deception that Forrest is going to use. And oftentimes, again, we could take his early career as part of that. You're going to be wanting to have these kind of, almost guerrilla-like tactics where it's not going to be all headlong assaults. There are going to be times for that where you're going to have to really seize the initiative and really strike at the enemy. However, you're also going to have to be able to minimize the amounts of casualties that you're going to take. And so Forrest is going to use some of these early deceptive tactics to force surrenders so that his men can live to fight another day, essentially. Bragg, though, is going to strip Forrest of his veterans at this point, forcing the cavalrymen to again build up his command. This is going to be a common theme, where Forrest is going to build up a cavalry command, and then it's going to essentially be given to Joe Wheeler, where Forrest is not necessarily going to be on the best terms with Wheeler. There's not really a whole lot of evidence that I've seen that he just outright dislikes Wheeler. However, they're just not going to be on the same page. And certainly post-Dover, here he is going to definitely not want to serve under Wheeler anymore. Whether through raids or fixed battles, Forrest was showing his quality. He could make a lot out of very little on campaign or in a fight. Late 1862 into early 1863 would see the gears shifting in the career for Stuart. He would raid all the way to Fairfax Courthouse and actually sort of ruin the strike by sending a telegram to Montgomery Meigs to request better mules as they were capturing subpar ones. This would lead to the engagement at Kelly's Ford, in which a valuable member of his staff and artillery, the gallant Pelham, would be mortally wounded. Stuart would be involved in the flanking move of Jackson at Chancellorsville and actually take over command of his corps when Jackson was mortally wounded. In this role, Stuart would actually do a fairly good job. It does kind of give us an idea of the subordinates that were under Jackson, though, and how there maybe was a little bit of a lack of trust that they were going to be able to pull it off there on the third day. But Stuart is going to launch a renewed attack that's going to be a well-coordinated assault. In so doing, Stuart is actually also going to be identifying the area around Hazel Grove as key terrain to the overall success of the battle. From there, Stuart is going to engage in one of the largest cavalry battles of the war. Pre-Pennsylvania invasion, Stuart would hold a review, always, of course, ready for the dramatic, especially if young ladies were present. Alf Pleasanton would be tasked with a spoiling effort on a potential raid, Hooker thinking that Stuart would be launched yet again, as he had early in the year, instead of this screening move into Northern Territory. The Federal cavalry with some infantry would almost catch Stuart at the Battle of Brandy Station, the rebel horsemen parrying one attack and then having to shift fronts. The battle would be a sort of draw, Stuart claiming victory, but he's going to be criticized for not being prepared for the Federals. This might have led to thinking he needed to get back into the good graces of the public. As it was, the Gettysburg campaign would begin with pretty constant cavalry engagements as the Army of Northern Virginia rolled into Maryland and then into Pennsylvania. This is where we get the famous orders from Lee that would be misinterpreted by Stuart. He would wish to ride around the Union Army yet again, but the fact of the matter was that he would have been much more useful for Lee had he remained in a better contact with Early, and if his horses were better rested. He would need to take alternative, longer routes around the Union Army to finally make it back to the Confederate lines. Now, there's always this kind of back and forth that you see. There's always a debate. You can have so many different sources talking about Stuart, and was it really his fault? And, was the route that he initially took, was that actually a better route for him to take? I have seen a whole bunch of arguments about that, but really, yet again, when you need your cavalry to kind of be your eyes and ears, just the fact of the matter was that the eyes aren't there. So then you have an infantry, and would Gettysburg still have happened? Yeah, maybe it would have, right? I think both sides were pretty much fairly certain that they were going to run into each other at some point, and Gettysburg was a possible location for that. But then you probably might have had just a cavalry-on-cavalry engagement to begin with, and then maybe it doesn't really evolve as it did. Once back with Lee, though, there is going to be the action on the third day at Gettysburg of East Cavalry Field. Of course, Gettysburg has it all. It has, all your common tropes. It even has a cavalry portion. And actually, if you go there, it's a very cavalry-specific portion of the battle where this is where the cavalry stuff happened, right? Which is very well organized, I guess you could say. Now, the significance of what Stuart was trying to do, was he really trying to crash in on the rear of the army? Was he just sort of just trying to get resources away from the various fronts that the Confederates were seeing, whether that's in this renewed assault on Culp's Hill, whether that is the assault on Cemetery Ridge? There's a lot of different factors in there. Certainly, we can kind of dispel the legend that Stuart launches his attack because he hears the artillery starting up, because there would have been just constant fighting in the Culp's Hill region. So there would have already been some artillery going. So we can't actually dispel that one. David McMurtry Gregg, though, is going to do a good job in waging successful combat against the rebels, as Stuart's going to be blunted, right? He's going to get his cavalry into a position, and a lot of people point at Custer and they say, well, he was the hero on East Cavalry Field, but a lot of times he's acting really under Gregg's supervision. Gregg's going to allow him to launch these charges that he's famous for. So David McMurtry Gregg is one of these guys who is going to be kind of on the back burner, shall we say, for saving the Union Army. And again, if he had failed, would Stuart really have been able to do a whole lot of damage? It's really hard to say. That's one of those what-ifs that I think is kind of even far-fetched a little bit for me, that he's really going to make an impact on that third day. Stuart, though, is going to continue to operate in the retreat of the Confederates, checking the Federals at Hagerstown in a key moment in helping keep the rebels from the Union Army catching them. Retreating into Virginia, Stuart would continue in battling his counterparts in blue, doing decently well in the Bristoe Station campaign. In the fall of 1863, we will have the affair at the Buckland Races, a successful trap that is set by Stuart. This is going to be kind of ending the slide of these questionable or subpar performances for him to close out the year. The relationships with other commanders for Forrest would come to a boiling point as we look at 1863 and the beginning of that year. Bragg he's going to dislike and would actually threaten to murder eventually. Joe Wheeler he would bump heads with as he was taking most of his veterans away from him. Even Earl Van Doren, who reportedly Forrest liked at one point, is going to be threatened. Again, this could be adding to the legend that is Forrest, but there are enough witnesses for some of these true events. Dover would be a setback for Forrest, who would again bump heads with Wheeler, inflicting heavy casualties on an assault on fixed positions by the Union troops. He would chase after Abel Straight's jackass cavalry, eventually forcing their surrender, despite not having adequate numbers. We can point to Forrest's ingenuity on the field for situations like this. He would use his reputation to his advantage, and his smaller units riding into various directions would make it seem like there were more Confederates than there actually were. Post Straight's raid, Forrest would be wounded by a disgruntled officer, a wounding that was perceived, again, as potentially mortal, but not before he hunted down his attacker and exacted his revenge. Reportedly, the officer had lost a cannon during the pursuit of Straight's cavalry. One of Forrest's brothers was wounded in the affair, and Forrest really liked his artillery and used them offensively on occasion, so he was quite perturbed. Also, at this time, we had a famous incident where Forrest is actually going to interact with a young Southern woman who is going to lead him to a ford to get around where the Union forces have set up defensively, and he's going to give her like a lock of his hair, and that kind of adds into his sort of legend. And he also, I guess we should also say that's kind of a positive one, and then a negative one you could say is that a scout shows up and tells him that he thinks this is where the Union army is, and he's going to, slap that man and say that he needs to make sure to know where these are, the enemy is, as opposed to just thinking that's where they are. So we also have that anecdote as well. This also could just be part of the overall legend of the cavalryman, as he was very shortly back in the saddle and participating in the Chickamauga and Chattanooga campaigns. We can take a look at these two campaigns and say that for all the smaller unit actions that are going to make Bedford Forrest, his larger command capacity is not going to be suitable for his talents. He would fail to see the big picture often, his hands-on approach removing him from the field at times when you really need someone to be the director. He was involved in the fighting, especially on the first day and the second day of the battle. Post-Chickamauga, Forrest would pursue the retreating Union army back into Chattanooga. Much is made of the claim that the Confederates would have stormed Chattanooga and made the victory complete. Forrest did advance with part of his cavalry, including his elite bodyguard, but he was going to be repulsed. It is overall unlikely that an attempt on Chattanooga would have succeeded, as the defenses were in place. It's also one of those things that you kind of point to as the legend that the Union army is just completely shattered, falling. Rosecrans is, crying in his tent or whatever it is that you see, and the Union army is so disorganized and they're starving. They have no supplies. And, then Grant has to show up and he rights the ship. And, had Bragg been a more capable officer, it's usually the narrative, then the Confederates might have been able to crush this part of the Union army. But really, if you think about it, again, Forrest does actually try to test the defenses. These are actually well-placed entrenchments, and the Union troops do have enough of morale to actually repulse any kind of attack. So, again, this kind of just adds into kind of a debate on whether exactly Forrest is really saying something that is believable or is actually going to be able to be successful. The relationship with Bragg is going to come to a close shortly thereafter. Despite being made a major general, Forrest would be shipped back to Mississippi. Bragg was ready to offload any officers who were against him, and so seemingly it's going to be beneficial to ship out someone who had actually threatened to murder him, which I don't remember Bishop Leonidas Polk doing. For 1864, Stuart had performed well for the first 3 years of the war, but the advancement of federal cavalry, I think, as we have documented in our narrative episodes, is going to finally catch up to him in this year. Really, that's why we see Kelly's Ford as being a significant engagement, not because really for the strategic purpose or the fact that Pelham is wounded mortally so at that battle, but because it's going to start to spark the Union cavalry. We can be on par with these Confederates. Then you're going to see the addition of equipment that is going to be more beneficial to the Union mounted arm. Everyone's going to have a repeating rifle. And although there were carbines in the Confederate ranks, they're not going to be quite the same as having this Spencer repeating carbine, right? Which is going to be really one of the more superior weapons that you could have on the battlefield in the Civil War. As it was, though, Stuart's going to play a big role and give a big contribution to the war effort during the Overland Campaign. Cavalry would be engaged in the Battle of the Wilderness, adding to the large casualty counts on the day. Prior to Spotsylvania, Stuart would arrive at the Laurel Hill location that would become a big anchor in the Confederate defensive front. Cavalry would fight a delay in action long enough for the Confederate infantry to arrive and spark the next bloody contest. It would be during Spotsylvania where Sheridan would move cavalry in an effort to bring on an engagement with Stuart, hoping to go toe-to-toe. It is questionable as to whether Sheridan should have been authorized to engage in this venture, as it took most of the cavalry away from the army. Stuart, though, was going to ride to stop the threat, infantry reserves being sent from the defenses of Richmond and Bermuda Hundred. Stuart's cavalry would be attacked near Yellow Tavern and would be forced to set up defensively. Leading a countercharge personally, Stuart would throw himself directly into the fight. This is really where we see kind of a difference between Forrest and Stuart, and in that it's not really usual for Jeb Stuart to be in the thick of the fighting, as Forrest, again, we have this kind of obsession of how many individuals does Forrest personally kill during the war, right? Stuart was in a desperate situation, and he needed to stem the tide of his breaking line. In so doing, he's going to be shot in the abdomen and thus removed from the field. He would make it to Richmond, but would succumb shortly after. There's one thing, though, I do want to point out in terms of this action by Sheridan, in that Sheridan is going to launch this attack specifically to beat Stuart, right? He's not really looking to accomplish a whole lot, right? And that it's very different than, say, like Alf Pleasanton or George Stoneman, for that matter, who are launching these raids with a purpose, launching these strikes with a purpose, right, against Confederate cavalry, against Confederate supply lines. Sheridan is going to kind of personally take it to Jeb Stuart, and the whole goal of it is to beat him. Maybe not necessarily to eliminate Stuart, as unfortunately it happens to him at Yellow Tavern, but it is going to be a raid specifically for him. And that kind of just, again, plays into the similarity that we see with the personality cult with Forrest and Stuart, in that even in this contemporary sense, Stuart's name is going to carry so much weight. In a lot of ways, it's like Jackson as well. You can kind of throw him in there, that we need to make sure to bring him down to earth. Like, the morale detriment for him getting whipped by Sheridan is going to be just as good, really, as him being mortally wounded on the field in some ways, right? So that is an interesting parallel that we see between these two cavalry leaders. Forrest, Kentucky, and Tennessee ventures would mar 1864. Having been sent back to Mississippi and away from Bragg and that army, he would try to turn back to raiding and other actions that had defined his earlier career. First, he would perform well in the Battle of Okolona, turning back a Union raid into Mississippi. The Delta area of Mississippi, Little Egypt, was key to agricultural efforts for the South, defense of which would be important. Forrest would personally be involved in the fighting, one of his brothers being killed in the action. There would be an ill-advised attack at Paducah, which would only rack up some Confederate casualties. In this instance, too, Forrest was unable to force the capitulation of the garrison by intimidation and deception, as he had had success with other raids in doing so. This would lead to an unfortunate event at Fort Pillow, as this garrison included not only United States colored troops, but also Union Tennessee troops, who had been a key protagonist of the Confederate populations, and whose ranks also included some men who had previously served in the Confederacy. Forrest acted unusual in this engagement, possibly affected by a wound he received earlier. This would lead to the brutal killing of some of the garrison as they attempted surrender. Overall, this event was unfortunate, as it might have been possible to surrender the garrison, but there was a delay that would include the antagonizing of Forrest's command. Forrest, rightfully so, is going to receive some negative press in this event, criticized for the killings. Negative repercussions would be seen as violent acts against other Confederates, and more resolved amongst the United States colored regiments would be results. Now, there is also, you kind of had this argument, right, where there is a repeat, actually, action there in the 1865 campaign for Selma, where Forrest is going to kind of remove himself strategically from a position where there could be some war crimes, right? And it could be just a coincidence, right? But there are some people who think that this was actually kind of a plan. There's really no evidence to support that Forrest was going to know that his men were going to get into the fort and they were just going to start indiscriminately killing those trying to surrender. And that's why he didn't go in with the first wave as he normally would have done in other campaigns. But that is where you have the argument, right? Where in this situation, in this other situation outside of Selma, Forrest is not going to be present. He's going to hold himself back because these actions, maybe he has knowledge of them, maybe he doesn't. The rebels would continue to campaign, Forrest winning maybe one of the better victories at Bryce's Crossroads, defeating federal forces in detail. In this battle, he would utilize the aggressive tactics of his command, including close-range artillery. Forrest would bump heads slightly with Stephen D. Lee, who would take the reins on the next action at Tupelo, a Confederate defeat, which would see Forrest's men be repulsed in several assaults on federal positions. Remember, we had Dover, Paducah, and now Tupelo as examples of Forrest's men attacking entrenched Federals and how it doesn't really work very well. S.D. Lee would get off a little easier than other superiors for Forrest, though. And that, I guess you could say, that Stephen D. Lee is not threatened with murder as a result of this action at Tupelo. Post-raids, Forrest would command cavalry for John Bell Hood and his army as it launched its ill-fated Tennessee invasion. Forrest would perform well in this campaign, trying to secure the cutoff of the federal forces at Spring Hill, and then being a key component in making sure the Confederates were not annihilated by pursuing cavalry following the disasters at Franklin and Nashville. Forrest might even have had a point in trying to flank the federal forces at Franklin and not engaging them directly. Hood would be added to the list of generals who would be getting on his growing list, as he would reportedly say that he would beat him within an inch of his life. Forrest would become a major general, once again serving in Alabama, where James Wilson would finally get the better of him in 1865. In this campaign, Forrest would add to his exploits and personally jump into action before the Battle of Selma. But Selma would be where Forrest would see defeat in an action where he had to act defensively, which were two things he was not really used to. After the war, Forrest would peacefully return to civilian life, but certain instances would mar this event. While conforming with the new state of the South, he would use convict labor on plantations in the same way he had used the enslaved. While he was at least going to not resist with upfront violence, he would line himself up, albeit briefly, with the KKK. While not a founder of the organization, he would be its first leader, the Grand Wizard, named as such for a nickname he had been given during the war. He would vacate the position within a year, and in congressional hearings he would deny involvement with them afterward. Forrest had been a key figure in recruitment, but what exactly his role had been past this is not entirely known, especially given violent actions of organizations like the KKK and others in the wake of the new amendments, the 14th and 15th. Forrest would be a good organizer, trying to focus the efforts on combating these amendments. Ultimately, his goal would be to return to the South in what it had been pre-war. Obviously, he had personally benefited from the institution of slavery, so something akin to that seemed preferable. In addition, in the immediate post-war years, 1867 and 1868, there was a feeling that Northerners and Republicans were trying to exploit the defeated South. Forrest attempted to have organized efforts to combat this, including dissuading black voters, sometimes with violence. Shortly into his tenure, though, he realized that things were getting out of hand, and he would break ties as a result. Like most things we have talked about with Nathan Bedford Forrest, it's sort of complicated. On one hand, you could probably say that he was involved in some violent actions that included, of course, this overall theme of racism, and he was involved with a racist institution before the war, but exactly the extent to which he was involved post-war, again, is kind of up to debate. So it's not necessarily absolving him from that action, it's just there is a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, and oftentimes, as we see in these narratives, it's a little bit of a mix of both. He would continue to seek out business ventures, getting involved in railroads after the war. He would pass away in 1877 due to complications with diabetes. So what can we say about Stuart and Forrest? In some ways, Forrest is the rebel. He does not respond well to authority, as we have seen. He takes charge when he deems it necessary. Action above else. He leads from the front and will go wherever he orders his troopers. We have pointed out that there is much fanfare given to how many soldiers he kills during the war. The same cannot be said for Stuart, which I think is interesting. Forrest was able to formulate at least a decent defense in Mississippi, and as a raider, he might have been the more effective leader than Stuart. His impact is really telling on the battlefield, as his reputation carries him in certain situations. The impact of Stuart is pretty telling in Lee's reaction to his passing. In here, we can also see the difference than in Forrest. Stuart was able to give accurate intel on the enemy to his army commander. We have great examples of that throughout his career. In this way, he is serving as cavalry as opposed to something slightly different, mounted infantry, right? Provide intel, support the army by screening, guard flanks or supplies. Those, in the contemporary thinking, are what cavalry is supposed to do. Forrest is obviously more of a combat operator. He was using his troopers outside the norm, focusing them on being mounted infantry, artillery, also being used as offensive weapons, playing into his legend. When you tightrope that, though, sometimes you can run into problems. A big problem would be that you have instances such as Fort Pillow and the aftermath of Selma. In fixed battles, Stuart seems to shine a little brighter. As we had mentioned, Stuart is going to have more experience with this, though, right? He's going to use that experience, and as a result, turn in fairly consistent performances. While maybe not being his forte necessarily, he's still going to have the bigger picture in mind, which is something that we see kind of lacking in Nathan Bedford Forrest. The two big blemishes in my mind are Brandy Station and Gettysburg. Both are sort of draws or kind of performances, if you will. But at least in the sense of Brandy Station, at least in the sense of Gettysburg, at least in those combat situations, he's not necessarily going to be just thoroughly defeated. They're both going to be kind of once again, draws as opposed to him being smashed, right? And Gettysburg is probably more marred in terms of the campaign leading up to the battle portion than anything else. I truly believe that part of the image that we have for both of these individuals is heavily based on post-war and lost cause narrative. Jeb Stuart, having fallen in the conflict, would be forever enshrined as the Knight of the Confederacy. He did not drink, he was a lover of good times and the company of women, although also loyal to his wife. Honorable is a word that we can use to describe him. The same probably cannot be said for Forrest. Forrest is more of a scrapper. He gets down and dirty when it comes to war. Somehow, he does get a pass for this. Maybe because he was something to grant hope to a dwindling Confederacy. A quick glance of these two will show them to be vastly different. While that is true, I think we have highlighted upon closer look, it seems, perhaps, that they have more common than you think. In initially running through what I have written here for this episode, I can also kind of throw in there that, there's multiple times, 2 times I think actually, that I have mentioned that Jeb Stuart doesn't drink, whereas Nathan Bedford Forrest also didn't drink. So there you have it, right? In the 2 personalities that you see, you are more kind of highlighting that and accepting of that of Stuart, whereas with Nathan Bedford Forrest, you probably just kind of assume that, he's kind of this hard-drinking, hard-fighting kind of guy, right? But again, there's a little bit more similarity even in that kind of just very niche thing of whether they drank alcohol or not than there is, than I think that there are differences. And hopefully you can make your own decision and be like, wow, Tim, you're really off here, or maybe you're right. You can be the judge. So we'll wrap up today's episode there. Today we went over an analysis of Nathan Bedford Forrest and Jeb Stuart, our first combined analysis episode. Next time I want to read some more contemporary ghost stories, returning that from our main narrative. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.